Good morning, everyone. We were just given a grace period for more attendees to join us, but I want to welcome you to our third webinar for our Men's Health Month Let's Hear It for the Warriors campaign. As I normally say each week, just to give an overview, this is sponsored by the Making Connections for Mental Health and Well-Being of Men and Boys in the U.S. grant, which is funded by the Movember Foundation and coordinated by the Prevention Institute. This webinar today, the title is Fostering Relational Strengths, the Role of Women in Supporting Men's Health. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Judy Chu as our presenter. And Dr. Chu is a lecturer in human biology and affiliate of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University, where she teaches about boys' psychosocial development. Judy received her doctorate in human development and psychology from Harvard Graduate School of Education and is the author of When Boys Become Boys and co-editor of Adolescent Boys, Exploring Diverse Cultures of Boyhood. She appears in and developed the accompanying curricula for Jennifer Seabell Newsom's film, The Mask You Live In. Judy currently serves as chair of Movember Foundation's Global Men's Health Advisory Committee, which focuses on mental health and suicide prevention. She is also the mother of a 16-year-old boy. So Dr. Chu, we welcome you. We are very happy to have you with us and participating as our presenter today, and I will turn it over to you at this time.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. Good morning to everyone. I think I'm going to try sharing my screen now and see if we can get this up and then play. Great. Okay, so we already went through that. So I thought I would give just a kind of broad overview of, in addition to Susan's description in the flyers that went out about this webinar, I thought I'd just kind of say, generally speaking, I'm going to talk today about the role of women in understanding boys and men's health, and then also in supporting boys and men's health. So I wanted to begin with just a quick definition of feminism, because I know that there are multiple connotations and definitions and understandings of it. And the one that I generally go by in my class and when I speak is that feminism is a radical notion that women are people. And I'll come back to this quote to expand on it a little later on. So I wanted to start with how women have contributed to understanding boys and men's health, because a lot of my research really is grounded in and founded upon the work of my advisor at Harvard, Carol Gilligan, whose work with adolescent girls is considered groundbreaking work because it really changed the way that we think about and talk about human development and psychology. One of the things that Carol, or Dr. Gill, I'll just refer to her as Carol if you don't mind, that Carol brought to the field is this feminist approach that really said we need to contextualize our knowledge. We need to contextualize our narratives. We both weren't super pleased with Harvard, but one of the things with Harvard is that their motto is veritas, which means truth. And as though, the things that they studied, the things that they generated in that institution somehow constituted truth for everyone. And we found that problematic because one of the approaches that Carol always applied when conducting research and in talking about anyone's stories was that you need to consider, who's speaking and to whom and in what body and in what, context, and telling what story about development and relationships and the human condition, because it matters. It matters where the stories are coming from, how we understand whose experiences are these. So it's not that we can just examine one group and then generalize from that group to everyone. That does everyone a disservice because it's such an imposition. So what happened was around the late 1970s, Carol, who had gotten her doctorate in clinical psychology at Harvard, kind of noticed something, a trend in the literature that she had been seeing in academia, and that was that most of the studies and the models of human development and psychology were really based on samples of middle-class white men in college. And so she said, you know, and so to her, one of the most glaring absences is where are the women? Where are the girls? You know, there's more to the human population than just boys and men, particularly that, you know, and that particular group of boys and men. And so her work began as a response to an absence that she noticed in academic research. And she said, you know what would happen? She just wondered what would happen if we studied women and girls? What would we learn by including women and girls in our research? And she was not interested in simply adding women and girls to existing models that were based on boys and men's experiences. She said, you know, this is really, it would be wrong to impose on girls models of development that are based on boys' experiences. So she and her colleagues at the Harvard Project on Women's Psychology and Girls' Development set out to learn from girls themselves, starting at early adolescence, you know, what their experiences were, and really seeking to understand girls' experiences from girls' perspectives. And so rather than, you know, I'm not sure how many of you are researchers, but rather than going in with kind of this preset theory to prove or a hypothesis to prove, or even a checklist that says, oh yeah, we see this in them and we don't see those, we see these things, we don't see those things. They went in a very exploratory manner that starts from a premise of not knowing. Like, we don't know what to expect. Let them tell us what they know. And what they heard in tracking girls' voices from ages around 9 years old to 12 years old was they heard evidence of, you know, stories about conflict and resistance and compromise when they were coming up against societal expectations and pressures to conform to kind of patriarchal norms of femininity, like ideas about what it meant to be a good woman or a perfect girl or a nice girl. And so, and they were finding that what the girls were expressing was that it wasn't a smooth transition. It wasn't like, oh, society expects these things of you, and therefore you just offer it and you become that thing. They found that the girls really struggled with that, especially if it didn't align with who they were or how they felt or what they were thinking or their beliefs, all those things. And so what happened was it was undermining their ability to be authentic or real in their relationships. And the girls demonstrated a resistance to that, a healthy resistance to wanting to preserve their sense. But we're really feeling conflicted because at early adolescence especially, it was very important. Social acceptance was important, feeling like they were a part of their communities and that they, you know, had a place in it and that they were acceptable and desirable was also a very important factor for them. And so they were feeling very at odds with, at times, with things that, with what people were expecting of them. One of the many kind of themes that arose in the girls' inner narratives was this conflict between self and relationships, that all of a sudden they were finding it difficult to both be true to themselves and to be in relationships with others. They were feeling compelled to choose between those two. So the girls would say things like, if I said what I really if I say what I really think and know and feel, my voice would be too loud. Nobody would want to be with me. But if I don't say what I think and know, then I'm not really in relationship. So either way, you know, it's kind of this lose-lose situation. Either way, they were out of relationship. They felt lonely, even when they had, you know, the appearance of relationships. You know, even if they had social acceptance, they felt like because those people don't actually know who I really am, they still felt a sense of isolation and not being known. And I would expand that to, you know, just to kind of foreshadow a little bit, I would say that whereas Gilligan and her colleagues found that the girls' narratives as they aged from 9 to 12 increasingly included the phrase, I don't know, even about things that they knew. You know, so they would say things about their experience and, oh, you know, I don't know, I don't really know. And what I found with my adolescent boys that I studied was that kind of similar to that was they would say, I don't care. And so I just wanted to kind of foreshadow a little bit. So the work that the Harvard Project did was really intended at first to complement, like I said, most, you know, for the first 100 years of psychology and studies of human development, you know, they were really focused, you know, it was primarily based on all male samples. And like I said, again, a particular group of males. And so the idea was like, okay, well, if we have these models based on boys and men's experiences, then we'll create models based on, you know, girls' experiences, and then we'll have at that time in a binary paradigm, then we'll have a complete set, so to speak. But what happened was, by listening to girls and also women in their studies, they revealed aspects about human development and psychology that had not been represented. They basically changed the conversation by introducing new experiences that they suspected were common to, that boys and men experienced as well, but that weren't in the literature. And so for instance, one of the things that the studies of boys and men had contributed to were these models of development that were really focused or emphasizing individuation and separation. So like, maybe when you're babies, you can, be dependent on other people, or when you're young children, that's okay. But as you grow older, you were supposed to become, you were supposed to prove your autonomy. You're supposed to establish your independence. You're supposed to show, especially if you're a boy, that you don't need other people, that you can be, stand on your own, all of these things. And so this idea that, development was a move toward the goal of individuation and separation, and that was associated with, growth and maturity, and for boys and men, masculinity. So part of becoming a man was showing that they didn't, they don't need other people, particularly women. And so, so really what the Harvard Project's work did was it challenged these assumptions about socialization and relationships, about what are the goals of development? What does it even mean to be, normal or healthy or well-adjusted? And instead of saying that individuals who couldn't, kind of smoothly and effortlessly conform to societal expectations that emphasized being separate and being individual, that maybe it wasn't a problem with individuals. Maybe it wasn't that they were falling short somehow. Maybe it was a problem with what we were asking of them. Because what the work with, what the work with girls and women really did was really emphasize and introduce a relational model of development. And that's to say that development is inherently relational, that it's not like we exist in a bubble in isolation by ourselves with the option of having relationships, but that our development occurs through and within our interpersonal relationships with other people, particularly those within our immediate context, like families and our friends and our communities, and also the broader context of our social and cultural beliefs and systems. And so really embedding our understanding of human lives and experiences within their interpersonal relationships, which up until that point had been seen as, oh, it's nice if they have relationships, but it was almost seen as an optional addition and more acceptable for girls than for boys. So this work with the girls and women raised new questions about boys, because again, it was conducted in response to the absence of girls, but because it changed the conversation, there were these new questions that said, well, what about boys? Are relationships also important for boys in the ways that they've been demonstrated and shown to be important for girls? And it seemed to make a lot of sense, and I'll introduce some research that kind of encouraged them to explore this further. But the key to this, in terms of the role of women and the role of, girls in understanding or introducing a new way of looking at and thinking about boys and men, was that girls articulated the struggle. And that's really important because in our culture, we generally tend to, for instance, we tend to gender things like emotions and relationships. We gender those feminine. And because we gender those feminine, it's more acceptable, it's more socially acceptable for girls and women to talk about it, to talk about valuing emotions and relationships, to talk about emotions, period. So just this idea that boys, of course, also have emotions, also may value relationships, but their code of masculinity discourages them from speaking openly about them, about those things a lot of times. Okay, so it's saying that my connection is unstable. I hope you can still hear me. So the girls articulated this struggle, that these patriarchal definitions of gender, constructions of gender, particularly femininity, could impact girls in a negative way. It could harm them, in terms of their psychological outcomes, in terms of their relationship health, by kind of constraining what they could express in their relationships when they have to at the same time demonstrate that they are good women. And so this raised questions about boys, and the question was that whether maybe patriarchal constructions of masculinity might also be detrimental or harmful to boys' well-being, despite the fact that the group, boys and men, enjoy certain advantages. There are privileges and advantages to being male and acting masculine. So the question was, you know, could it be that even though they are the dominant group in our society, or they are the privileged group in our society, could there also be psychological and relational costs to conforming to those norms? So one of the research that I mentioned that encouraged the Harvard Project and Carol Gilligan and her colleagues to kind of feel that this was worth considering was that, you know, infant studies that were happening around the same time, also in the 70s and 80s and 90s, were really showing that, you know, all people, regardless of gender, are born with a fundamental capacity and a primary desire for relationships. We're born into relationships. We have this a need to bond in meaningful ways with other people, if we're just, you know, for our literal physical survival, but also in order to thrive emotionally. And so that really, again, kind of changed things, because the kind of the going belief at the time had been like, oh, well, boys and men, you know, they're even as late, you know, as recently as the 90s, there are people who would say, well, boys and men are just not inherently relational. You know, they're not interested, they're not capable of having relationships or expressing their emotions. A lot of kind of ridiculous claims like that. This idea that, oh, well, boys and men are like that because that's how they're born. And so the infant studies stand in stark contrast to that. It provides evidence that no, actually, all babies are born needing to connect, to have nurturing, you know, responsive relationships with their caregivers, and that determines whether they thrive, and it's essential to their health. So there's a really nice example. If you ever Google, you know, electronic and still face, it shows this interaction of mother and child, and showing how, you know, the whole process of development is really a constant dance and a constant exchange, where they're in sync and then they're out of sync. And when they're out of sync, or called mismatch, coming back, having opportunities to reestablish connection. So mismatch and repair. And actually, Tronic has a book that just came out this month called The Power of Discord, which kind of casts a light on parenting, in the sense that it says, it doesn't, you know, parenting or any relationship isn't about everybody being in sync all the time. And, you know, it's just kind of like everything's rosy, everything's positive all the time. Actually, they argue, the infant researchers argue, that what makes a healthy relationship is when we inevitably fall out of sync, when there are inevitable conflicts and mismatches, that we have opportunities to repair those mismatches and to come back into sync. That builds our sense of resilience. It builds our trust in relationships, that relationships can be resilient. And that's essential to a child's healthy development, and also an adult's healthy development, knowing that, you know, we can argue with our best friend, but also we can talk to them and come back and clarify any miscommunications. And that repair is essential to, again, our faith in being able to be in relationship with other people in authentic ways. But coming back to the infant research, what they really showed was that, you know, the infants are really active participants in the relationship, that they're perceptive and that they're responsive, and that when there is a mismatch, they pick it up. They notice it, just like, you know, adults would. If somebody, you know, is upset with you, or they haven't, you know, responding to you in a way that, you know, concerns you, we'll say, oh, you know, is something wrong? And so they, you know, there's a discomfort and a distress when we feel that the connection, something has happened to disrupt that, and we make effort, you know, we make an attempt to reestablish those connections. And infants as young as 2 months old were able to detect those mismatches. So in contrast, or just kind of in comparison to the infant studies, which show this fundamental capacity and desire, there's also research that shows that older boys, like late adolescents and adult men, tend to report, you know, fewer close relationships and lower levels of emotional intimacy in those relationships. So this discrepancy between infancy and later life periods, indicates that somehow boys' socialization or boys' development is associated with a move out of relationship or away from relationship. And so, Carol was my advisor at Harvard, and under her supervision and with her guidance, I decided to conduct some exploratory studies to reconsider and revisit boys' development through a relational framework. So in light of relational theories and using relational methods. And so again, the relational theories, what they really, you know, emphasized was this idea that relationships were not just, you know, nice to have, or a good bonus or a plus, but that they were central to our development. So the centrality of relationships in human development and psychology, and this idea again that the psyche is embedded within interpersonal relationships as well as within society and culture. And then also very important was the idea of using relational methods, because when Gilligan and her colleagues went to study the girls, again, because they took this exploratory approach, because they wanted to be able to discover things that they didn't already know or didn't already think, they used this, what they call the voice-centered approach to psychological inquiry, which really focuses on understanding the other person's experiences from their perspective. And instead of saying like, well, I think this is going on for you, isn't that true? That instead of coming in with a presumptive approach or assumptions, we go in with a really emphasis on humility and respect for what the other person knows, with a desire and a genuine curiosity to learn from them about what they know. And it starts and centers on developing comfortable, trusting relationships. Because the idea behind, one of the tenets behind relational methods is this idea that the data you get, the quality of your data, or the stories that people are willing to share with you about their experiences will depend on whether they trust you, how they perceive you, who they think you are, what they think you're trying to do. And if they don't trust you, the stories that they share with you about their lives are going to be very different than what they would share with you if they believed that you were genuinely interested in understanding what was happening for them. And so to the as much as possible, I really tried to approach it with a again, from this premise of not knowing what was going on. I would tell the boys, I don't know what it's like to be a boy. I'm really wondering what's going on. And they were wonderfully generous in kind of taking me under their wing and letting me know what I needed to hear and see and understand in order to fully grasp what was happening for them in their lives. So these exploratory studies focus on the boys' perspectives, and what's informed by, again, just this general sense of wanting to understand what was going on for them, but starting from, but in light of some of the research that I just told you about. So like, what does boys' development look like when we start from the premise that, like all humans, they rely on relationships to survive and thrive? So if we know that in the beginning, their first reality is in relationship, enmeshed in relationship, in these, then what happens when we look at boys' socialization, which says, oh, they have to go and they have to be tough and they have to be stoic and they have to be self-sufficient? How do they get there? What does that experience feel like for them in order to accommodate those societal expectations that tell boys that in order to be a man, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and especially when X, Y, and Z might conflict with what this kind of sense of being very relational and relying on relationships and valuing them and being very vulnerable and nurtured by them. What is that like for boys to undergo that transformation in order, for the sake of proving their masculinity? So, and the other kind of general thing that I was looking at with both, I studied adolescent boys from ages 12 to 18, and then I also studied younger boys, ages 4 to 6. And so with both groups, I was really looking at socialization messages about what it means to be a boy, and pressures to accommodate group and cultural norms of masculinity about what it means to be a real man. So and one of the things that I found in both age groups again is that boys have these relational strengths that, or call them strengths or capabilities, which are often overlooked and underrepresented, both in academic literature, also in their everyday lives. I noticed that boys have the capacity to be fully present and genuinely engaged in their relationships. In my book, I have case studies of boys and show the ways in which they are authentic and direct and articulate and attentive, like all these things they're able to do in relationship. And with the adolescent boys, I also noticed, similar themes of self-awareness, of sensitivity to emotions. They're tuned to social dynamics. They're reading interpersonal dynamics very astutely, and they're modifying their behaviors accordingly to try to make their entry or their participation in their social groups as smooth as possible. So they're avoiding negative consequences, and they're trying to fit in and establish acceptance and belonging. And that these relational strengths, their ability to communicate, to connect with other people, these are not, it's important to realize that, to emphasize that these are not feminine weaknesses, but human strengths. Oftentimes we think about, relational capabilities or anything to do with emotions in terms of oh yeah, we expect girls and women to be good with that. That's their arena. Girls and women are supposed to be really good at doing relationships. They're supposed to care about relationships, and that's a feminine thing. And so there's this misunderstanding or this myth that, for boys and men to do it, that's somehow a liability, that somehow threatens to emasculate them if they also have these sensitivities that ultimately, serve them well, not just in their personal relationships, but in their professional relationships. I mean, if you think of, all of the adult world, all of the things that we prepare children for in this world involves interacting with other people. So yeah, the more that they are self-aware, the more that they are socially astute, the better off they're going to be. They're going to fare better. But again, boys' socialization as defined or kind of crafted under patriarchy tends to push them away from these sensitivities, these strengths. And so, and like, I argue that these relational capabilities are essential to their health and happiness. So what does it mean that we're moving them away from those? So I had mentioned that they tend to be overlooked and underestimated. There's a couple reasons why we do this. One of them is that we don't expect to see them. I mean, everyday life, we notice the things that we look for. So if we expect to see, boys being rough and tumble and being, all, kind of running around and whatever, then when they do that, we say, oh, look, it's boys being boys. I actually personally hate that phrase, but they say it's boys being boys when they're hitting each other and when they're yelling and screaming and they're, rambunctious and all these things. But when they're sitting quietly and reading a book, or they're snuggling with their parent, or they're being really thoughtful and considerate, nobody says, oh, look, it's boys being boys, right? And so we tend to notice what we expect to see. And because we tend not to expect boys to have these relational, strengths, have these emotional sensitivities, we tend not to notice them as much. Or when we notice them, we might even worry that, oh, is this boy going to be picked on when he goes to school? Or are other people going to somehow view him as lesser than? Or if a man shows these things, is he going to be viewed? And of course, the boys and men themselves know this, that if I reveal these, if I cry in front of somebody because I'm sad or I'm moved by something, what are people going to think? And are they going to think less of me? So they're constantly negotiating how they present themselves, how they behave, how they engage with other people, not only in terms of how they're feeling as an expression of how they're feeling, but also in anticipation of how others are likely to respond. And they learn to anticipate those things through their everyday observations and experiences. I mean, some boys are told by people that boys don't cry, and so sometimes it's as explicit as that, or sometimes they'll cry and then somebody will shame them for it, maybe indirect, like, what are you doing? And so even if they don't say the words boys don't cry, boys learn that when they reveal their vulnerability, they're regarded as weak, and that jeopardizes their manhood, and they want people to like them. They want people to think that they're valuable and worthy, and so they're careful. They learn very adaptively to be careful about what they reveal to other people, to be selective. And so as a result, so the other reason that we tend to overlook and underestimate them is because one thing, we don't expect to see them, but also boys learn through their socialization not to show some of these things. They learn what's okay for them as boys to show in order it to still be acceptable and desirable. And they learn to cover up the things that they suspect or they've observed other people to not value in boys. So just to kind of briefly go over boys' gender socialization, and what I mean by that, I'm talking about kind of the content in terms of first and foremost, this idea that boys and men need to prove their masculinity. And so this idea that, and namely by rejecting femininity. So they need to show that they're real boys, because even, somehow, culturally, Margaret Mead was an anthropologist who first kind of pointed this out, that there's this need for boys and men to prove their masculinity in ways that are different than, we don't really ask women to prove their femininity or girls to prove their femininity in the same way. Although that's not to say that a woman's femininity won't be called into question, but not in the same ways that boys and men seem to have a continual struggle and a continual need to demonstrate. And even like on days like, even a boy who does everything right, like follows, he's tough and he's stoic and he's projecting this image of self-sufficiency, you know, he could wear a pink shirt, or if he cried, you know, during a movie, you know, during a touching movie, anyone anywhere can call him out and say, oh, I saw you crying, or I saw you wearing pink, or I saw you hugging that baby, or whatever, and say, oh, you know, I don't know about your masculinity, or you're not a real man. And you know, all the language around, you know, this kind of gender policing that boys and men experience. It's like when they're not in this man box, this idea of, you know, this really narrow conventional idea of what masculinity is evidenced by, they can be called a lot of horrible names, oftentimes homophobic names, oftentimes derogatory toward women names. They can be called women. I mean, and that's meant to be an insult. And so there's this overarching theme that they need to prove their masculinity by, as much as they can, distancing themselves and distinguishing themselves from anything feminine, including girls and women. The second aspect of boys' gender socialization is their context and the cultures of boyhood. And in both of the age groups that I studied, in early childhood and adolescence, there is this predominant theme of hierarchy and competition. So very much like a zero-sum game. Like if someone's going to look good, someone else is usually at the cost of somebody else looking bad. And so this in the boys very, again, astutely perceive this about their context, and they learn to protect themselves. You know, they learn to protect their vulnerability. They learn that this is not a safe place for me to be kind of open. One of the things that I noticed with the younger boys that really struck me was just how very open they were in their self-expression. I mean, they kind of wear their hearts on their sleeves, so to speak. Like, if you never had to guess what they were thinking and feeling, because they would come right out and tell you, you know, oh, I'm happy today, or I'm sad today, or I'm really, you know, frustrated, or sad, you know, disappointed, or I'm afraid of this. They'll just tell you what kind of, it's really unfiltered in a way, and in a way that's so honest. But when they enter schools, for instance, at around age 5, or preschools or whenever, they start to notice, wait a minute, there's a hierarchy, and the boys who are more open and vulnerable in this way tend to fall lower on that hierarchy. And you know, not only that, if you reveal things about yourself, other people can use it against you. And the adolescent boys, you know, articulated that as well. He's, you know, one of the boys told me, you know, if you spill your guts to just anyone, like if you just tell anybody how you're feeling, there's not only the you know, there's not only the chance that someone could use that against you and make fun of you. And so in that kind of perceived boys to kind of, again, rein in and kind of be more, learn to be careful, because they don't want to put themselves out there if people are just going to take advantage and trample on them. The third aspect is processes, because a lot of times in the literature on boys' socialization, they tended to depict it as this kind of linear model of cause and effect, where the messages and pressures associated with their socialization just come in, and then as a result, boys have these attitudes and behaviors. And it really kind of overlooks the psychological aspects, this idea that individuals are not passive recipients of culture and just, you know, automatically, you know, take in whatever culture tells them to do. They are active participants. They're able to mitigate the impact of their socialization messages and pressures, how that impacts their outcome. They can mitigate that by the ways that they make meaning of those messages and the ways that they choose to respond to pressures to conform. And so there's a lot of room for group and individual differences in their experience. And then the fourth component to touch on is the timing, that the timing of the social, of course, the messages and pressures are ongoing, and they can come in at any age. But the two periods that are considered critical periods for boys' socialization are early childhood and adolescence. And I can speak more to that in terms of my finding. So one of the things that I observed in tracking boys from age 4 to age 6 was that I noticed a shift in their relational presence. So like I said, when I first entered this room in the first few months, they were very open, very honest, very just kind of out there, what they're, you know, when Carol had asked their parents, you know, what is it that you see in your boys at this age that you just love, and you think to yourself, I hope he never loses that. And the fathers, for instance, would talk about their spunk. They're just, you know, they love so freely. They're just not, they're not careful, which the fathers were a little bit worried about, because they're like, oh, I'm worried that because they just say it, whatever they're thinking, that somebody's going to tease them or reject them, and that will be painful for them. But on the other hand, they loved that that spirit that the boys had. And then what I found was, in tracking them over the first year of their, you know, the pre-kindergarten year, was that they were experiencing some of that feedback, some of that negative feedback, and realizing, oh, maybe it's not so safe to just say everything that you're feeling. I need to be more careful, especially as a boy, because there are real consequences. You can get, you know, excluded, you can get ridiculed. The other boys, you know, will not want to be with you, or, you know, in fact, there was even a consequence that I document in my book where one of the boys deviated from that, and he was actually allocated to the girls group. And so this idea that you could lose
Your connection went down. Sorry about that. It seems like her connection went down. I know at one point she said that her internet was showing unstable. Hopefully we can get her back.
Okay, so she dropped off.
She's still there, but we can't hear.
Hi, Susan, can you still hear me? I think I might have
dropped out for a bit. It had been going in and out, but we could always still kind of like get back to you and hear what you were saying.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not moving at all, but I think maybe the Wi-Fi is just, okay, so I'm sorry. So I was talking about this shift in the boys' relational presence and how that reflects how they're reading and responding to their socialization. So what I was seeing was that as they began to, you know, to align with group and cultural norms of masculine behavior, whereas they had been so obviously articulate and direct and authentic and attentive, they began to look inarticulate and indirect, inauthentic, inattentive. In other words, they started to look like stereotypical boys. So they learned to project, boys learn through their socialization to project this image of masculinity that's familiar because it looks like our stereotypes about boys, but it misrepresents them. And so what I called it, how I described it was they move from presence to pretense by way of masculine posturing. And so a lot of times what we see in boys, and we think, oh, that's boys' nature when they're being, you know, all these kind of, you know, when they're displaying stereotypical behavior, is actually their accommodation to cultural norms of masculinity that say that boys are supposed to be rough and tough and stoic and not need anybody. So like I said, it's their accommodation, and it's, again, socially adaptive because they're becoming, you know, they're gaining perhaps the status and power of the dominant group by identifying with that dominant group, but that there are psychological and relational costs. And that especially because even if as a group they are privileged or are told they're entitled to power, as individuals, they may not feel powerful and they may not feel secure about their status. Like I said, at any moment, someone could question their masculinity and they could lose that power and they can lose their identity as a boy. So the boys, interestingly though, I mean, although there is this overall prescription to prove their masculinity, that wasn't I didn't find that to be the primary motivation in the boys that I studied for their conformity to masculine norms. They were really driven by this desire to connect with, particularly with their peers. So it wasn't a general desire to prove their masculinity. It was a desire to connect with specific individuals. They wanted to identify with the boys. They wanted to relate to the boys and to the girls, but they wanted to relate to people as a boy. And so this was how they were being told, or how they're being taught, and how they understood, you know, they could do this. And ironically, so you look at it, it's kind of this sad situation, or what my students described as, it's a trap, because they're told that if they do these things, that the society tells them, in order to be a real boy, you do these things and then you'll gain acceptance and people will value you. But that path, those scripts actually lead them away from the emotionally intimate relationships that they're seeking, that motivates their behavior and their conformity in the first place. And so, and the reason it leads them away is because their socialization forces a split between what they know, all of their emotional sensitivity, their relational capabilities and strengths, all that they know. It forces a split between what they know and what they show. So they're not supposed to show those things because, again, those things are gendered feminine and therefore a liability for boys to show those things. And so, and when we understand that, you know, our relationships depend on our presence, how we bring ourselves into those relationships, and vice versa, our ability to bring ourselves fully and authentically into relationships depends on our relationship, like whether we perceive those to be safe for us to do that. You know, then they get, if they're not able to express a full range of their humanity and to be themselves, then they end up having kind of what Gilligan calls pseudo relationships, or relationships that are the appearance of relationships, but they don't feel like anyone really knows them and understands them, which it can be very lonely and isolating. So this has implications, as you might guess, for their, you know, their well-being. So they've learned to deny and devalue what society is feminized. So again, this idea of taking care of yourself, self-expression, relationship, even learning, you know, this idea of like loving to learn and being really curious, that involves putting your heart and soul out there and being open to the world. It feels vulnerable. And so they learn that, you know, or even you hear in the kids in the schools, you know, don't be a try-hard. And that's something you'll hear among the boys, especially. You don't want to show that you're putting in an effort, because then that shows that you care. And then that sets you up for being mocked and ridiculed, or being, you know, questioned in your toughness and your ability not to care and to be in control and to already know everything anyway. And so this idea that they learn to deny those things. So as a result, you know, as they learn this masculine posturing that gets them social acceptance or approval, or at least a stamp of social acceptance and approval, they can appear incapable and uninterested in emotionally close relationships. They may look like, you know, they're not, they may seem like they're not noticing things. They may seem like they're not interested in engaging, when it's actually, you know, the exact opposite. And when they put on that masculine guise, when they posture in those ways that show hardness, toughness, stoicism, it's harder for us to engage them, and it's harder for them to engage us. And so there's, again, it contributes to a sense of loneliness and isolation. But the good news is that they demonstrate a healthy resistance against this kind of trajectory, this socialization default that kind of carries them away from relationships in the name of masculinity. I noticed there's evidence, not just in my studies, but also in, you know, in studies of adult men, that show that throughout their lives, boys and men continue to seek connections and resist disconnections. And that, of course, they have agency. So like I said, those psychological processes in their socialization, so their ability, that the conformity and their kind of surrender to social pressures, it's not automatic or inevitable. They're absolutely able to resist. And so even though their relational capabilities and strengths become less apparent, like we don't see them all the time, they're not lost. They are still there. They might be dormant or hidden, but they are not lost. And so coming back to the title of the talk today, I am trying to bring it back to how women and others, everyone who engages with boys and men, can really support their health. Well, first of all, you know, because, you know, our development and our existence and our lives are relational in nature, through and within relationships. And so you think about, you know, how we interact with them at home, at school, at work, through our professions. There's a lot of ways that we can reach and engage with boys and men in ways that can be helpful to them. I always say, in terms of research, but also in terms of any intervention, that it has to start with listening. And I mean, listening with curiosity, with humility, with respect, with a genuine desire to understand what's going on for them. Not a, you know, it can't even be, you know, coming in with it like, I'm going to fix them. I'm going to, you know, that's so condescending, and it's just so insulting. And they, you know, of course, people are smart. They pick that up immediately. I mean, if someone comes in and talks to you in that way, and you know they think they're trying to fix you, your response to them is probably going to be pretty skeptical, if not outright reluctant. And so, you know, really seeing them for who they are, letting them share with you their stories as they would tell it, you know. So one of the things that the adolescent boys highlighted, and the reason why I started looking at younger boys as well, was because the adolescent boys were describing to me that there's this gap between the way people see us, or the way people see boys, and the way we experience ourselves to be. And the way that the adolescents spoke about that gap was, you know what, I just have to accept it. That's just the way things are. Life is just that way. People just are not going to know who you really are. And that was such a lonely depiction, and such a kind of, not pessimistic, but just a defeating. And so there was a sense of like, they were coming to accept that, I should stop wanting this. I should stop yearning for connections that aren't going to happen in this world, in this society. And so when I told that to Carol, she said, you know what, you need to look younger. You need to look when they're first coming up against it and they're not yet willing to accept it, when they're actively resisting it. And so that's why I started studying the younger boys. But again, with both age groups, really setting in to understand what was going on for them, in their words, on their terms, what they're going through, what they're worrying about, what they feel they're up against. So starting with listening, in order, if we want to support them, we have to first figure out where they're coming from and try our best to meet them where they are. And I know that none of that is new or kind of life-changing for any of you, but like, that's just where do we begin? So, and another thing, we want to challenge these stereotypes. I think a lot of times boys' socialization, in terms of the content and the messages that they're hearing, really implies or heavily suggests to them that there is one right or best way to be. And that if you are not that image of hegemonic masculinity, then there's something wrong with you. And that, you're not going to get all the things that men who are that image of masculinity, or actually Joseph Pleck argues that no man is ever that completely that thing, that they all perceive themselves as falling short at one time or another. So he actually argues that it's an unattainable image of masculinity that leaves individual boys and men to strive towards an image in relation to which they will inevitably fall short. And that has implications for their self-esteem and for their sense of security and their sense of value. And so it's really damaging, kind of this idea of pushing, you have to be this one image. And then if you're not able to do that, which again, nobody can, the individual's made to feel shame because they're made to feel like it's their fault, that there's something wrong with them. Whereas again, the girls' work demonstrated, and the boys' work also shows that actually the image that we're asking of them is unreasonable and in some ways inhumane. And so I'll go into that more. But so again, just kind of really from an early age and throughout their lives, really emphasizing this idea, there are multiple masculinities. There are probably as many masculinities as there are boys and men. Like there are, lots of ways to be a man, and it isn't just this kind of stereotypical ideal that our society has crafted for us. And so Canada actually had this wonderful campaign that said, my masculinity is mine to define, which I really loved. And so that's in contrast to this idea of telling individuals that they have to become something else or something more in order to be valued or in order to be worthy. And the thing is too, is that even though the hegemonic ideal of masculinity is what kind of comes to mind first when for instance, if you ask a classroom of boys, and at any age, what does it mean when you hear the word, when you hear someone say, be a real man, what does that mean? And they know that one because, they see it in the media. That's the one that we hear about. You have to be tough. You have to be stoic, strong, protect women, all these things. You have to not show you can't cry. But if you ask them, what do you think it means to be a good man? They can tell you that too. So they already know at some level that there are more, there are multiple masculinities. There's more than one good, way to be a man. But it's just the one that kind of most convenient, the most available image, the one that comes to mind first is one that may not be the most healthy. So just kind of reminding them of what they know, that, there's lots of people, and then who do you admire and what do you want to aspire to? And using that to challenge stereotypes. So yeah, so there's exceptions to this, right? The stereotype isn't the only way to go. And again, I'm talking about kind of younger kids, but sometimes I think some men can also be reminded of this, that they're, to be validated in saying like, whoever you are, however you are, that, it can't make you less of a man because, there's so many ways to be a man. And so this is coming back to that first quote that I started with, was, feminism being the radical notion that women are people. I bring it back to, also the radical notion that men are people, because I think a lot of times in our society and culture, we treat men as though they are robots, they fall down if they fall down, they cut themselves, they're supposed to pretend like it doesn't hurt. I mean, the human body experiences pain. It saves us from putting ourselves in danger, but yet boys and men are told they're just supposed to suck it up and act like it doesn't hurt. And it goes even more so for emotional pain, because at least if you have physical pain and someone sees that you're bleeding, they can at least maybe offer some empathy and sympathy and say, yeah, I can understand how that could be really painful. Although again, in some contexts, on the sports fields, men are still, expected, or military, they're expected to be like robots and not feel that. But then emotions, even more so. If they're feeling sorrow, and if you're feeling sadness, our society as a whole tends to be very, very intolerant of boys and men's humanity. And I think that needs to be changed, that needs to stop. And so the other thing, so along the same lines, we need to help to alleviate the shame that starts so early for boys and men. Again, around this, anything that makes them vulnerable, anything that makes them human, we somehow have found ways to shame them. So I was reading a finding that said, boys and men's most common shame trigger is the fear that other people will think that they're weak and therefore unworthy. So again, that goes into, think about like if you're a young boy or even a man and you're trying to avoid having someone else kind of discredit you or to claim that you have no value, then all the things that, there's just huge list of the things that they can't show if they want to avoid having people think that they're weak. And so we need to let them know, first of all, that they're not alone. They're not alone in struggling with these impossible ideals of masculinity. I think one of the things, I interviewed a couple hundred boys altogether, adolescent boys, and almost all of them at the end of the interview, I'd ask them, do you have any questions for me? And all of them wanted to know, am I the only one who feels like this? Am I the only one that's having a hard time, being all these things? And I loved being able to tell them, every single one of your peers feels exactly the same way, because it's an impossible standard and no human can possibly be all the things that we've deemed, the ideal of masculinity. No one can be all of those things at all times. And so let them know they're not alone. Let them know they're not weak, and that, and to the extent that we can, help them to overcome the shame that might have been socialized into them around their humanity. So, So I guess, part of that is welcoming. I didn't know what the word to put with vulnerability. I said, I thought about creating space for vulnerability or welcoming vulnerability, but ultimately just enabling individuals to be themselves without the fear of disapproval and rejection, to having spaces for that. And that again is how women and girls in boys and men's lives, how we can do that. We can create those spaces for the boys and men that we know. We can give them permission to care, which again, all these things, emotions, caring, nurturing, relationships, love, all these things, because we deem them feminine, are that much harder for boys to value, to strive for, without feeling concerned that somebody's going to shame them for it because men aren't supposed to do that. So, but in a paper that I wrote recently that's currently in press, I said, vulnerability is actually really important because it's necessary for learning and for love. So we can't learn something unless we can admit that we don't know it. And so when you have a masculinity that tells men to act like they know everything all the time, that creates very little space for them to actually learn something new. And when you think about how that can manifest in the classroom, somebody who, especially if they're struggling, they can't ask for help because that would admit that they're struggling, which had to also admit that they don't know something. And so the inability to be comfortable with vulnerability can get in the way of learning, both in school and outside. And then the other side is love. I mean, in terms of not just romantic relationships, but to love is to make is to bring yourself very honestly, very openly, very raw, vulnerably into a relationship, and to open yourself to the possibility of rejection. When we love, there's always the possibility of loss, but without bringing it ourselves in authentically, then emotional intimacy is not possible. So all the things that boys and men it becomes more difficult for them to achieve because, how masculinity can get in the way of those things. We can clarify our values, what women can do to support boys and men by especially the younger boys, because again, I'm thinking about like the younger boys that I worked with and the adolescent boys, they're figuring out how it's possible for them as boys to be in the world and to be with others. What will be acceptable? What will be appealing? What will make them lovable, right? And so we can show them why we value them. And a lot of times, unfortunately, men and boys are taught by societal messages, again, that, oh, well, we value you if you're the breadwinner, if you're the provider, if you're the protector. But what we really need to emphasize is that we value them for who they are, not what they do. And so I made this up the other day. I said, it's their presence and not their presence, like not what they're able to give us, but that we value who they are in our lives, the role that not the role that they play, because again, that gets towards like kind of provider and protector. And I just wanted to, it's not to say that they shouldn't do those things at all, but that's not the only reason. Like, oh, if you think about it, like if a boy or man were to say, oh, if I were to leave, what would you miss about me? You don't want to say, well, I would miss the fact that you bring home, the paycheck. That's not, hopefully that's not what we would miss about them, but they need to know that that's not the only thing we'd miss about them. And I think we don't tell them that, at least what I'm hearing from the boys that I interviewed in my work, they don't hear that because they're taught, again, by media messages, but also by just kind of their views of what do men in our culture get valued for. Oh, well, they get valued for, providing for their families. And so if they somehow lose their jobs, then that really undermines the role that they view themselves as being valued for. And so we need to clarify our values for them. And I know that I need to wrap up so that you Q&A, so I'm getting to the end. So the overarching theme is we want to foster their connections to self, which I call it in terms of evidence by their presence. So would be like their self-awareness, their self-acceptance, their ability to preserve their sense of integrity, right? And to realize this range of their humanity. Terry Real said it really nicely in terms of the gender binary and the constructions of masculine and femininity. He is a family therapist and couples therapist out in Boston. And he said, when we take the whole range of human qualities and we divide it in half and we say this half is masculine and this half is feminine and only boys and men can be masculine and only girls and women can be feminine, then everyone loses, because they're forced to cut themselves off to a part of what makes them human. And so when we tell boys and men that, and girls and women, and when we tell anybody that, they have to suppress parts of themselves in order to gain acceptance, we lead them to a certain loss. They're in terms of how they're able to be with other people and how they're able to know themselves. The other side of it is fostering connection to others. So again, I was saying that, that presence and relationships are interdependent. So presence depends on relationships because we're able to be fully ourselves in relationships when we feel like there's support for it. And then we have better relationships when we're bringing ourselves fully and when we're fully present in our relationships. So connection to others would be relationships, like where we feel truly known and accepted, which there was an ad health study done. It's a longitudinal study, so it's still ongoing, but it began in the 90s. And they found that in this huge study that started in Minnesota that reached tens of thousands of adolescents, they found that the single best protector against psychological risk, like low self-esteem or depression, and social risk, like substance use, risk of unintended pregnancy, dropping out of school, the best protector against both psychological and social risk was having access to at least one close mutual confiding relationship. And that could be with a parent, it could be with a teacher, a friend, it could be with anyone, but the kids who had at least one of those protective relationships fared much better in terms of their developmental outcomes. And so, and then part of that had to do with, having had some experiences of trust, being able to trust someone, having someone trust them, being comfortable, feeling validated and supported. So the sense of belonging is incredibly important to people's health and happiness. And so we support their healthy resistance against impositions that threaten to undermine their integrity, that threaten to force them to, I always say there's a distinction between, I created this word over-compromise, because, I think in our culture, we always hear, oh, never compromise, you should never compromise. But I think that's a unreasonable expectation, because anytime you're in relationship with another person, you have to compromise because nobody gets their way all the time. So compromise, negotiation, cooperation, that's all part of being in relationship. But I think over compromise is what we're really hinting at when we say don't compromise. And that's when you compromise, when you're so busy accommodating to what everybody else asks of you that you lose your sense of of yourself. of what you want. So you might ask a kid, you know, oh, well, what do you think about this? And they're like, I don't know, just tell me what to think. Just tell me what to feel. It's easier that way. Just tell me what you expect me to be. That's a surrender that actually leads to psychological, has negative consequences. So, sorry, I mean, it's over time. So let me just wrap this up then. And in terms of, and the reason I say identity drives behavior is because Dan Ariely, who is a social psychologist at Duke University, emphasized that, you know, one of the things we can focus on if we want to help boys to see other options, that there are other ways for them to be, is by not giving them a list of, oh, do this, this, and this instead of this. I always say it's not about replacing one list with another. It's not about saying like, oh, instead of being a macho man, I want you to be a sensitive man now, because those are both, even though one is might have more healthy aspects than the other, it's still asking them to measure themselves by an externally imposed set of standards. So really helping them more to be aware of the influences in their lives, where they're feeling pressure, where they're feeling support, but also staying very much, again, that connection to self, very much in touch with how they're feeling and being able to trust their instincts and to know who they are. So Ariely's, to give an example of how he distinguished that, he said, instead of, you know, for instance, if he was talking about college kids and cheating, and he said, instead of saying don't cheat, you say don't be a cheater. And so if you, instead of telling boys, oh, well, you should do this, this, and this in order to be healthy, just have, you know, help to foster their sense of someone who, seeing themselves as someone who is healthy, who is connected, who cares, and the behaviors will follow, well, according to Ariely, the behaviors will follow because when they perceive themselves as someone who does these things, someone who cares, someone who is connected, then they'll also be more likely to live their lives in ways that reflect that. And finally, I just want to say, you know, we joined the resistance, which is the title of one of Carol's books, Joining the Resistance. And I want to emphasize that it can't just be women. It can't just be women telling boys and men that it's okay to express emotions and to value relationships, because it is kind of like saying, well, my mom thinks that's okay, because that's still, you know, boys and men need to see all kinds of people, you know, really realizing and expressing a range of human capacities. They need to see, you know, role models of all kinds so that they know that this isn't just something that girls and women do, that this is something that people do, and that gives them permission to do it as well without feeling like somehow they are deviating from the norm for their particular subgroup. Jackson Katz emphasizes that one way to kind of sell this to boys and men, or to also the people working with boys and men, is to say, it's not sensitivity training, because again, that kind of makes it sound like, oh, you're turning boys and men into women and girls, but it's about leadership training. It's about good leadership. The good leaders care about people. And so when we suppress that in a portion of our population, we are really, you know, robbing our societies and communities as a whole of something that is valuable to the society thriving. And so, like I ended with, you know, healthy connections are not zero sum, because there's sometimes we'll argue like, oh, you're paying too much attention to boys, you know, you're not paying attention to girls, you're not paying attention to, or one or the other. And when everybody's more connected to themselves and to others, the entire community thrives. Okay, sorry I went a little bit over time. Let me
That was
sharing.
good. Thank you so much. A wealth of information. This is the time, I should have said at the beginning, but I forgot to do so, that we have time for question and answers at the end. You can type in your questions in the question and answer chat, or you can unmute yourself, or if you need me to unmute you and ask your questions. So before they start coming in, Dr. Chu, I have two questions. Would you tell us a little bit about the ethnic or racial composition of the boys that you interviewed? And even if it may not include boys from other races, do you think in your work, in your research, that this could be applied to boys from different races if your research was a multiracial? That's my first question.
Okay, that's a great question. So the ethnic composition, I was working in the Northeast because, as I said, I was doing my studies while I was at Harvard. And so they were mostly suburbs, or some, actually one of the populations, some of the populations were in New York, some of them were in New Hampshire, but they were mostly, I would say more than half were probably Caucasian. There were some Black youth. There were some Latinx youth. The population in New Hampshire was more heavily Latinx. There were some Asians, but so in terms of like starting from the most to the least, it was probably Caucasian, Black, Latinx, and Asian. But the Asians, there were just a handful. There weren't very many Asians. And then with the younger boys, it was a very, very small sample because I studied them very closely and followed them for 2 years. So it was all of the boys in one class, but that was only 6. So for early childhood, those were more in-depth, close studies, and those were 4 of them were Caucasian, 1 was African American, 1 was Korean American. Yeah, but the ones in New York City, there are a few different sites, but I would say in New York City there were more. There were more. The school that I was at was in Harlem. And so, and it was 95% free or reduced lunch. And I would say that was, there were very few Caucasians at that school. That was more, I would say 90% Black or Latino, maybe 5% Asian, and then 5% Caucasian. So I don't know if that gives a sense, but in terms of the studies, I find that, because there's also different, whereas the Harlem school had more kids from working class families. I was also at a private independent boys school outside of Boston that had, probably, they had a few scholarship students, but most of those students came, were middle class or upper middle class. And so, but in terms of the overarching things, I found that like maybe their language around the things differed. Like, the boys at the private school maybe used fancier vocabulary, but when I can contrast that with the boys from Harlem, the same themes were coming up, like in terms of, because this idea of human connection is one that most people identify with, and this desire to be known and to be accepted was definitely a theme that is generalizable. But that said, we definitely want to be respectful and considerate of how it would manifest. So like I was saying, you always, with any group that you're working with, you always want to start with, what's going on for them, what's important to them. And so, I would never argue that you could generalize from a group of 6 boys to all boys. I always say, like, maybe in my book, I say, you might recognize some of the things that these boys are going through, but, don't just automatically assume that's what the boys are going through. And especially because it's also, different by time. Like even, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I mean, with the prevalence now of social media, I think the kids going through what they're going through now is probably more intense in some ways, because they're constantly being, feeling monitored, constantly crafting their online personas. And so there's an intensity there that, I certainly don't envy young people right now, because I just feel like there's so much pressure all coming from all directions. And that's another thing that they need to deal with, that my studies, because they happened before the kind of social media rise, definitely weren't as impacted. But again, you still see common themes, because one of the common themes of adolescence for all time is this figuring out who they are, figuring out how they can relate to other people, figuring out, whether they can be people of value in their community and whether they can establish a sense of belonging. I think some of those fundamental kind of human condition themes are ones that most people relate to, even if it plays out differently in different communities.
Because obviously our organization is tribal servant, so our focus population is Native American. It will be interesting to see if you were to continue working with different populations, different races, different ethnicities, if you would find similar findings. But from what you said, even though the samples were small, and working in different areas with different groups, you saw common themes of the need for connectedness,
right?
Need for social interaction, the things that you shared about perceptions of masculinity. So probably, even though, like you said, all good research knows that you can't necessarily generalize something from working with a particular group of people, but it would be interesting to see if you were to continue your research with different populations, if you would find some of those similar themes. So, yeah.
And some of my students have, I mean, I'd mentioned to you, Susan, that some of my students are Native American or grew up in Native American communities, and they've actually taken the work. And, first of all, in the classroom, when they read the work, they say, oh, this resonates with what I saw growing up too. And then some of them have gone on to, even at a national level, serving Native American communities and using a lot of this relational theory and this relational approach to helping to foster their health. And so I had mentioned, unfortunately, my student, I had invited him to come present with me today, but he's presenting at a bigger conference this week, and that he was really, really tight. But he works with Zuni kids, and he definitely, uses this relational model to help foster their well-being, because he sees them struggling, and he works, he was my student in 2015. And so he's actually held different positions. And one of his positions was actually just working at a high school, very, very directly, coaching the track team, volunteering as a counselor, all these things, and working with the kids, but very much bringing a lot of, Gilligan's work and this relational theory to saying, helping them to foster a sense of, connection to themselves and to others so that they can thrive, because he just found that there was a lot of not hopelessness, but a lot of struggle. This sense of belonging was really, really one of the big
The
themes.
American community that you're talking.
Yeah. And so he is working, like I said, he's working on various levels now. He just left a position in DC that was at a national level, but where he was advising people on how to advising people who are interested in developing interventions and programs in these communities to support youth, and really, again, focusing. He loves this concept of not just health, but also happiness. He really believes in kind of positive psychology, and what are the factors that enable a positive, outlook and attitude. And so he wanting to help to foster that in the youth that he works with and in his communities. And so I think there are applications, but again, the warning is always like, but don't just come in with a template and say, you're going to fit this template. You always want to work with, and he does that too. And so various, and I had other students also who were from, not the Zuni, but different Native American communities who have also taken the class and then adapted the theories to bring back with them when they go home in the summer, or when they go home after graduation, to work with the communities to build them up. So.
Very good. Does any of the participants have any questions? You can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself to speak. If not, I have another one for you. What implications does what you share, how does it apply to health and I know you touched a little bit about their emotions and all of that, and that would have to do with mental health, but how do you see some of the manifestations of having to suppress your emotions and your feelings and stuff like that? What implications would that have for both physical and mental health? Because I think you gave an example of how the adolescent boys were struggling and saying, we wish that, we could be different, and that made you start working with younger boys. So then we think about adolescents going to men, and then, we hear all the time that men, they don't seek medical attention easily for preventative services. And, in everything that's going on in the current environment, men are more at risk, more men are dying from COVID-19. So how do you think your research plays into the whole aspect of mental and physical health?
I think a lot of it is, absolutely. Well, first of all, I want to mention Will Courtney's work. He wrote a book called Dying to Be Men, and it examines exactly, the kind of overlap between his work and my work is, again, looking at how messages about masculinity and pressures to kind of adhere to those conventions of masculinity that tell men they're not supposed to admit weakness, well, then that's going to influence what they do when they need help, And so, one of the examples that I think illustrates that really well is if they wait longer to report discomfort and pain, like with something like cancer, where early detection is so crucial. You know, when they wait, then that actually limits their options once they get there. And then also not just waiting to go to the appointment, but also in the context of the appointment, you know, again, kind of, even though they may not link it directly to, oh, I'm trying to be a man and therefore I'm not going to tell the doctor things, it's so ingrained in everything that they've learned that they'll be like, oh, you know, I think I'm fine. It's really no big deal. And if they're giving inaccurate descriptions of how they're feeling, and the doctor has to rely, you know, the physician or the healthcare worker has to rely on their self-reports, that can also really hurt the physician's understanding of how to help them best. And so definitely there are things that can play out or even like, and when another researcher who studies men and masculinity said that for himself, you know, he had this tooth pain and it was basically an infection, but he waited and waited because he's like, oh, I don't want to complain about this. And finally it was, you know, he waited so long that he was in, you know, in excruciating pain. And then once he got it fixed, he just thought how ridiculous that was, that I was so, you know, immobilized by this, you know, and it wasn't even like a conscious, explicit sense of, well, I can't or else I won't look like a man. It was just a sense of, I'm not supposed to complain. And so sometimes it's not even, you know, like I said, it's not necessarily this explicit, like, I can't do it because then I wouldn't be a man. It's just this thing of like how they're taught, like what you're allowed to show, what's within their realm of perception of what's possible. That influences the choices that they make. And so it's not that they're trying to be macho. It's just that they have been taught in a way that leads them to associate immediately feelings of shame with asking for help or with showing that they're not entirely okay all the time. And so, and of course, you know, again, humans, we all have our ups and downs. We all are going to experience, you know, and so to ask these impossible, holding boys and men to these impossible standards really gets in the way of their ability to take good care of themselves. And even if we do go back to that whole, like, be providers, be breadwinners, be protectors, even their ability to take care of other people, because if they can't take good care of themselves, then they can't be there for someone else either. And so I don't know, you know, there's multiple ways to kind of try to appeal to, you know, men, to let them know it's okay. And in fact, it's better for you and it's better for everyone around you if you can, you know, if we can help to kind of undo some of the things and, you know, some of the damage that boys' socialization. I never like to talk about it in terms of toxic masculinity. I don't like that phrase because it implies that somehow there's something wrong with being masculine or there's something wrong with boys and men. I think it's really that it's toxic patriarchy, that, you know, that our society has these, you know, again, unattainable goals that they've prescribed and that they fiercely hold men to, and they cruelly police men around, that are really not conducive to their health and their happiness and their longevity. And so, yeah, absolutely, there are implications not just for their mental health, but also for their physical health. And then, you know, we're seeing that, you know, with the COVID response, like, as you said, you know, if they're going to not wear their, if they're not going to be careful because they're not supposed to act like they care and they're worried about dying or getting sick or whatever, then that's really going to impact, you know, how they conduct this. But it's complicated as well, though, because sometimes it's not just gender, it's not just masculinity. Like one of the other global advisory committee members, Daphne Watkins, she's at University of Michigan. And she actually worked with last week's speaker, with James Smith, but she pointed out that sometimes it's not just gender because, for instance, Black men said that if they wear the masks, sometimes that makes them look scary to other people. And so they might want to wear it, but then they, again, you know, this also, you know, I guess one of the common themes is as we go through life, we're always negotiating between what we feel inclined to do or what we want to do and how we worry other people will perceive us and how they'll respond to us. And so, you know, those are all very real things that can impact men's behavior. So when we talk about wanting men to choose healthy behaviors, it's not always a matter of saying, go choose some healthy behaviors, because there are reasons why they do the things they do and behave the ways they do. And often those are even, you know, good reasons, even if they don't serve them well. And so we have to look at what locks them into those those routines and those choices. And we have to not just we can't just empower individuals and say, go do what you want. Because if the systemic, you know, structures that are in place that are oppressing them and limiting their choices, if those haven't changed, then empowering individuals can only do so much. It's not sustainable change. And so that's why, you know, in addition to that, we need to shift the social norms. And that's another thing, like social norms are comprised of what individuals believe people who are like them are doing. And so that's another reason why when we connect men to each other and show them that they're not alone, that shifts in their minds, their perception of what's the norm, what other men are doing. And when they see that, oh yeah, other men are struggling too, and I don't think they're horrible or shameful because of it, hopefully that gives them permission to acknowledge and feel okay with whatever they're feeling too. And that's so important.
Very good. So what I hear you saying a lot, different things. One is around presuppositions. Sometimes, we can't always assume, because it's easy to assume, well, okay, the reason why all men are not wearing masks is because, they think this or that. But there you said, African-American men, they're perceived as a threat already. And then, they put a mask on. And then it goes into the whole thing of health behavior change. Often when we look at health behavior change, we think of an individual model or individual behavior, but there's the whole ecological model around behavior change that looks at systems, right? So when you're talking about, just to give an example, generally in health, why won't people eat healthier? And oftentimes when we say that, we look at, well, okay, the doctor tells you go home and eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, so that's individual behavior that they're concentrating on, but we don't look at the ecological system. Do they live in a neighborhood where they can have access to healthy foods? Or you tell them to exercise, you focus on the individual behavior, but do they live in an environment where it's safe to even go outside and engage in physical activity? Or do they have to compete with traffic to be physically active, So these are some things that we really have to really look in a more broad-minded scope than just looking at individual behavior. So, yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Or do you have anything else, Dr. Chu, that you would like to share?
No, I guess no, I loved how you said that, in terms of that example of health and exercise and looking at kind of what's feasible for them, given their context. And I think also, because it's so important, again, to not just focus on the individual, but to focus on, everything that's structured around them socially and culturally. And then, but if we also look at, and I think the idea is saying facilitating the channels on both levels, both for individuals, because they do, we do want to say you do have some power. So when it is an option, when they can exercise and when they can eat more healthy, and if the limits on that are not the main factor, then how do we kind of help them to incorporate the healthier behaviors? Because I think, again, using those 2 examples, we all know that we should exercise and that we should eat healthy, but the extent to which we actually do it is another factor. And so kind of looking at, when we facilitate the channels, we kind of identify, what are the gatekeepers, so to speak, in our lives? What would it take? What are the things that makes it easy for us not to do it, right? And how can we make it so that we don't have to? And so there's also little tricks around that. But again, I think the bigger concern too, though, is, like you said, the bigger contextual factor of if they don't have grocery stores nearby that carry fresh fruits and vegetables, then that, and so, I think too often the conversation does tend to focus on, oh, the individual just needs to do more. And I think we don't take enough account. We don't hold society accountable enough for making it possible for the individuals to actually make those healthy choices. So I think that what your point was really beautifully said. And one of the most important things to focus on is how can we, if not as society, in terms of the whole country, but as a community, how can we facilitate the channels, and how can we make it easier for them to make the choices that they want to make? I mean, I think oftentimes too, there's kind of this victim blaming or not that they're victims, but just there's accusatory tone of oh, well, why don't you just do this? And it's well, they want to do that. And so we need to look at what some of the real obstacles they're facing are and help them to kind of break those down so that they can do the things they want. They want to be good fathers. They want to take good care of themselves. They want to take good care of other people. So to kind of give them that credit and then to work with them to help them achieve those goals. And so it's just not a, somebody outside coming in and telling the other person what to do, but really working together, that those tend to contribute to the best and most sustainable change efforts, you know, that we could make.
Wonderful, wonderful. This has been a very great presentation, very good discussion. And one of the things that you shared was listening, you know, so much begins with listening. So if we're going to, you know, change or improve mindsets around socialization of males, it begins with listening. And again, not just listening, you know, one-on-one, but listening as a community, you know. Native Americans culture is built a lot around community. And, you know, in some Western cultures, you know, it's about the individual, you know. So like the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to change behaviors, you know. So what you shared begins with listening and coming together as a community, whether it's a work community, it's a community of faith, it's a cultural community, whatever community it is, it takes coming together and looking at how we can, you know, shift norms and change mindsets and all of those kind of things. So this has been a beginning step to doing that. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. You really
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to be here. And I think, I mean, if I could just add one tiny note to what you were just saying, because it just relates the same thing, is that people can tell you what they need if they know that you're really interested. And so, I mean, I think that everything that you said, it just comes back to that same point, is that, you know, we listen because they'll tell you, but they have to trust that you really want to know. You can't just be in like, oh yeah, we're here to hear from the community. You know, if they know that you really, you know, are listening and you're really interested, they'll tell you. And so, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. This is being recorded. So for participants who want to get hold of the recording, you can actually probably give us a few weeks, and all of the webinars, all 4 of them, will be uploaded on our SPTHB website at some point in the future. And you can access this webinar and the 2 preceding webinars. I do want to acknowledge our executive director, Nick Burton. He is on the webinar. So Nick, if you want to, Mr. Burton, if you want to say a few words before we close out, I will invite you to do that. And next week's webinar topic, our last one, is going to be COVID-19 and men's health. We're going to hear from some leading men's health experts about emerging data and trends that you're seeing in relation to COVID-19 and men's health. Let me see if he is still there. Is he still there? Okay. All right, let me see. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Burton.
Excellent. So hearing me loud and clear? Yeah, I see my name's up there. So Dr. Chu, thank you for joining us and celebrating Men's Health Month with us here at Southern Plains Tribal Health Board. Last week, we had the opportunity for a international worldwide conference. So we're doing a lot of firsts here. And actually for us doing these live webinars, we never thought we would be doing it because we were very much traditional in our thinking. And so, you know, in-person, face-to-face meetings. So we had to retool a lot of what we do here. And even as a former tribal health director, certainly acknowledging men's health and what we can do for the men and boys. But what you bring in a different perspective of the females and bringing that in to the conversation. I certainly do appreciate you taking your time and working with us here. And thank you to Susan and our men's health team as well. I appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you all for joining us today, and we hope that if you haven't already registered for next week's webinar, that you will go ahead and do that. Again, the topic is COVID-19 and men's health, and you can find the registration information on spethb.org under our trainings page. Thank you, Dr. Chu. We will be in touch, and thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.